Hello the world, hello the internet, hello Jason Isaacs, and hello to our live studio audience. We have a live studio audience and a small dog here, so anything could possibly happen in the next 7 or 8 minutes. I'm doing this because I want to get this out as quickly as possible, because there's perhaps something out there that's confusing you a little bit. And obviously there's a lot going on, a lot being spoken about Trump and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And I wanted to have my tuppence worth on that. Now, what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to do a deep dive into the background or into the deal itself. Those two are covered extremely well in these two websites that I will link off to. Hip Hughes, some of you may or may not like him. I genuinely don't care. He is very, very, very good as far as I'm concerned. And the Congressional Research Service document on the Iranian sanctions is amazing. It's extremely thorough, and it certainly helped me get my way through this particular presentation, or at least find the bits that you need. So in other words, I've read that, so you don't have to. But don't let that stop you. It's really good. Okay, so let's have a look at this deal from the US point of view. The first thing to make clear is that it is an executive agreement. It is not a treaty. And it's not a treaty for the simple reason is that there's no way on God's green earth that the Senate was ever going to sign off on this particular deal, not with the strength of AIPAC, not with the strength of the Saudi lobby, not with all of the other various forces that were competing for the attention of the Senate, for the attention of the Senate. So this is an executive agreement. It is an agreement between Obama, in his capacity as chief executive of the United States, and Iran, and various other countries, notably those of the EU. Now, in order to get this deal through, the deal, by the way, which stopped Iran's, or rather it didn't stop, it put a pause, it put a break on Iran's development of a nuclear program, a nuclear weapons program, get it right in the end. In order to get that into effect, existing sanctions had to be put aside. Now, these are a load of sanctions. And the important thing to note is, first of all, they have been in place for a very, very long time. I didn't have time to put all of the dates on these, but they go back a long time, certainly pre-2015. Some of them go back to 1979, the original Iranian Revolution. So these have been in place for a very long time. And the other point to make is, of course, that they are, in the main, acts. They are laws passed by Congress. There are a few executive orders there, that's for sure. Those executive orders largely deal with the freezing of assets in US banks and in other US facilities, other Iranian assets that have been frozen in American banks, which is something the president can do. But why I wanted to deliver this presentation and why I wanted to get it out quickly is to look at this idea about Congress and its role in sanctions. Now, we've talked at great length about the role that Congress plays in foreign affairs, and I think we have concluded that by and large it plays a secondary role to the president. It's really there to sign off and enable the president to do the things that he wants to do, whether it's to sign a treaty or start a war or have an extended military action or anything along those lines. Congress is there to enable the president to do something that he wants to do. The thing that Congress gets to control, largely trade and aid, because they are described by law. And this made me think, well, hang on a second. How is it that Trump is going in and unilaterally tearing up this particular deal if it has a huge section of it that is described by law? If so much of this deal, if so much of the Iranian deal is described by sanctions or is related to sanctions, how is it that Obama was able to get this deal agreed to in the very first place? Well, the answer is something called an executive waiver. Now, before you start thinking that this sounds like something a very, very posh person puts in their ice cream, it's not. The best way to think about an executive waiver is that it is a pause button. It is a monumental pause button. Now, where does this pause button live? It lives in legislation. Who puts the pause button in the legislation? Well, Congress puts it there. When Congress, or indeed when any other legislature for that matter, when a law is being drafted, the legislature accepts that there may be a situation in the future that right now it can't necessarily foresee, where it may be necessary just to put this legislation on hold for a temporary amount of time. It's not cancelling the legislation. It's not killing the legislation. It's not repealing the legislation. It's just putting the legislation on hold. And Congress, when it writes that legislation and it puts that waiver in the legislation, accepts that the person who is best placed to trigger that waiver, who is best placed to put the legislation on hold, is the president. This is what it looks like in practice, and thank you to Wikipedia. You guys can read that in your own time. What I want to stress now is that the legislation exists. The legislation continues to exist. The waiver does not overrule or strike down the law. It is a temporary suspension. It is putting the law on hold. These waivers will expire after a certain period of time. At that time, the executive can decide either to press the button again or to let the legislation kick back in and its terms apply in the real world. That's exactly what's happening here. In order to get the deal with Iran, Obama, back in 2015, had to press pause on all of those laws describing the sanctions. And when those waivers expired, as they would do after a time described within the law itself, he had to decide whether or not he was going to push pause again. And he did. Again and again and again and again. And the next time it came up, or rather what's happening now, is that the expiry period is coming up again. Trump is looking at the pause button and he's wondering whether or not he should push it. And of course, we all know, based upon the news over the last couple of days, that he is not going to push that pause button. As a result of that, the waivers will expire, the sanctions kick back in, and get this, who breaks the deal? Not Iran, but America. America, by reimposing sanctions, is essentially reneging on the deal. It is breaking the deal. And we are back to where we were in 2015 with American flags being burned in Tehran and presumably Iran about to embark again upon a nuclear weapons program. So here's our pause button. Obama pressed it. Now it's come round. It's Trump's turn. Is he going to press it? And he has told us no, he's not. So that has gone. Okay. What does that tell us? Well, let's break it down into exam world and the real world. It may seem kind of trivial to be focusing on the exam with such monumental issues at stake, but if the end of the world is coming, it's probably not going to come before you sit your exam, so we may as well get this out of the way first. This is all about foreign policy and the way in which the executive steers foreign policy. The executive controls foreign policy largely through executive agreements, seeing as the Senate is unlikely to agree to any treaty anytime soon. Congress does have a role in foreign policy, largely through sanctions, also aid, and again, enabling the president to do the big things that he wants to do. But it is largely a secondary position. The job of Congress is to enable the president to undertake those big, massive, grandiose projects that he cannot do by himself. If you want to know what this means in the real world, I'm going to link off to this podcast at the bottom of this presentation. The Daily, if you are not listening to it, it is just flipping superb. This one is kind of scary. In fact, I haven't heard anything quite so scary for a long time. Do listen to it. It gives you some background. It gives you a lot of detail and an awful lot more about what might be happening next. But that's it from me for the time being. I wanted to make sure that you knew how it was that Trump could control the imposition of these sanctions. With any luck, I've explained that to you. If you find yourself going into a deep dive in waivers in the exam, you're probably in the weeds. You should probably be putting that time to more constructive use elsewhere. But at least you now know how it is that Trump is able to impose these sanctions, or how he's able to kickstart the sanctions when sanctions are clearly described by law. And they are. That's it from me. That's the end. I hope that makes sense. I hope that makes you understand now how that confusion can be resolved relatively simply. I'm sure there's going to be questions forthcoming, but thanks for sticking with me so far, and good luck. Bye.